Welcome you all for this seminar on our GCMs Obsolete. I've already seen that there's a lot of excitement about this topic amongst faculty, among students. So I'll start right away by introducing Professor BALAJI, who is a distinguished fellow at Schmidt Futures. Professor BALAJI joined Schmidt Futures as distinguished fellow in June 2022. There, he is bringing together a talent venture team for Schmidt Futures and their science team to ultimately design new programs in climate and computational sciences. He's joined there after having a successful career in academia for 25 years in Princeton University, during which he served as head of the modeling systems division at NOAA's GFDL, the celebrated GFDL, which made pioneering contributions to development of the first climate model. I guess he will also have few slides showing, maybe making connections about the Nobel Prize that was won last year. In 2017, he was among the first recipients of President Emmanuel Macron's Make Our Planet Great Again, his French president. So he was one of the first recipient of that award. And through that, he has been associated with Institut Pierre-Simon Laplace in Sorbonne University, France. Along with that, he's already heading several other, works for several other panels and committees in the United States and worldwide. Kind of making, so here, his in general interest is in climate computing geophysical data. Professor BALAJI holds PhD in physics from Ohio State University in the United States and Masters in Physics from IIT Kanpur in India. I liked the last line that I found from Schmidt Futures. So it says, he is interested in short, everything. But more narrowly, the application of advanced technologies and methods to hard science problems and broadening access to these tools in undeserved communities and the developing world. So let's put your hands together to welcome Professor BALAJI. We are very fortunate to have you here.
Thank you very much for this invitation to all of you, to you for your very kind introduction, to Professor Shubhi Malghosh for inviting me here. So I'll talk about GCMs, as he already alluded to. GCMs are general circulation models or global climate models. The GFDL, the lab I worked in, was the pioneering institution that actually started this work. The institution is in Princeton, and the formation of this institution actually goes back to the start of computing itself, because John von Neumann, who invented the digital computer that we know today, was working in Princeton, and he said one of the applications should be to do weather forecasting in a new way by basically writing down the equations and then putting them on a computer and integrating them forward, because these are nonlinear dynamical equations that are very hard to do without a computer. So my talk is going to be talking about what is a GCM, how Manabe, who is by the way, the Nobel Prize mentioned was not won by me, so it was won by Suki Manabe, who was mentioned here. And Manabe, what he designed as and then how the GCM has evolved to present day, and why some people are saying that the GCM is no longer useful. And there are many problems in climate science, which is why I think it's still a great place to be working in. We know the basic result of what is happening when you keep adding CO2 to the atmosphere. The planet warms, and when the planet warms, many things change. The circulation, the general circulation, which means the flow of air around the globe and the flow of water in the ocean, it all changes. And how those changes are going to affect precipitation so that it changes the places where there's rainfall available. Many things change because of climate change. Biodiversity, ecosystems change. So we understand the basics of it, and we understand that why this is an emergency right now, but there are many details still to be worked out. We are quite reliant on computing technology, and the computers are getting bigger, but they're no longer getting faster. I'll talk about that in a minute. And what we are trying to do, because you cannot keep running bigger and bigger models on bigger and bigger computers, what do you do instead? So I call this climbing down the ladder. The ladder is what was invented as the ladder of complexity of models. It's also called the hierarchy. So from simple models, you build more and more complex models as time goes on. But at some point, if you cannot run the most complex models because of limitations in computing, you have to start climbing down to try to develop simple models based on complex models. And then I'll address this question of why people argued that GCMs are obsolete, and I'll give you a preview so there's no suspense. I'm going to answer that GCMs are not obsolete. So we still need them. So what is a GCM? We can start with this result, one of the results that led to the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021, which is a 1D model of what happens in the atmosphere if you double CO2. So this is just 1D, so you're just looking in the vertical. So this, the y-axis is the height of the atmosphere, so it's around going up to around 30, 40 kilometers, and that's the temperature. So radiatively, it's heated by solar radiation, so the surface is being heated and the heat is being lost to space, because if you treat it as a black body radiation problem, heat is being lost to space. So there's cooling aloft and there's heating at the ground, so that stratifies the temperature. It creates a gradient in temperature from warm to cold. But when the gradient in temperature exceeds some threshold, the atmosphere will start convecting. It will start overturning and it will mix it up. So it will decrease the stratification. So these two processes, radiation and convection, will eventually come into equilibrium, which is called radiative convective equilibrium. So this is what Manabe modeled. So he starts with some distribution and he keeps running the model for a long time. And eventually you will get a stable curve of temperature that looks like this, for a given amount of relative humidity and a given amount of CO2. Where CO2 becomes interesting is that it will change the radiative balance. When it changes the radiative balance, it also changes the humidity, it changes the distribution of convection. So what he showed was that when you keep increasing the CO2 from 150 parts per million to 600 parts per million, doubling and then quadrupling of CO2, if you see the surface temperature, it changes by a few degrees. So he said, well, this might actually happen to our planet, because we could, by then we know from there were measurements which were made in Hawaii at the observatory called Mauna Kea starting in around the 50s. It is far away from any industrial source, so we know that the CO2 is not coming from a local source. There was the Mauna Loa Observatory it recently had a volcanic eruption, but normally it does not happen. And so that is a measurement of CO2 around the whole world, because it is not close to any source. That was showing that the CO2 was increasing. And he said if the CO2 keeps increasing, the planet is going to warm. This is a result actually that was, people know that CO2 increases warming. It was known before, but he actually showed it using the vertical dynamics. But of course, then heat also moves horizontally, so you need to bring in the horizontal dynamics. And so then he worked together with Kirk Bryan, who built an ocean model. The first ocean land model was highly simplified. Obviously, there are no real continents and all that. And in this model, they were able to model the two processes together of how the ocean and atmosphere will interact. Because if you heat up the atmosphere, some of the heat will go into the ocean, because the ocean can serve as a heat sink. So you have to model the two. And both will have flows. So they will also both distribute heat horizontally as well. They can move it, because most of the heating is coming in the tropics. Most of the heat is being lost near the poles, and that movement of energy from the equator to the poles can be done both in the atmosphere and in the ocean. So there's amount of, all these things are getting partitioned. All these things are going to change the circulation. So eventually they got to this 3D model, where now initially they showed you how the CO2 will change the distribution of heat in the vertical. Now they're showing in the horizontal as well. Now this is heat as a function of latitude as well. The dots are some observations. So the solid line is what you do with the observed levels of CO2, and the dashed line is what you get with a doubling of CO2. And again, it shows everywhere it's going to warm. So by 75, we already knew that something is happening to the planet. Okay, it's now almost 50 years later. We are still not really doing anything about it. So we have been pretty lax about dealing with the problem. And on a technical level, he showed that this is not based on how we initialize the model. You can start from a warm planet or you can start from a cool planet. It eventually equilibrates to the same temperature. So this is called the equilibrium climate sensitivity. That is, for a given amount of CO2, that last value that you see, I don't know if you can see my mouse if I move this, yes. So this last value that you can see here is the equilibrium temperature. And this temperature will go up if I increase the CO2. And this difference of temperature is what we call the equilibrium climate sensitivity of the model. In this model, it's a very simple model with a very low resolution. It will reach the equilibrium in a matter of a couple of years, 700 days or so. Today, when you include all the physics in the model, this can take on the order of 1,000 years. It's important to know because you have to run these models for a long time in order to understand what is happening to the system, because the ocean is a very slow-moving thing. So the ocean controls the long-term memory of the planet. All right, so this is that's a GCM that was Manabe pioneered, a couple of others as well, Arakawa at University of Los Angeles and Jim Hansen at NASA as well developed similar things. But this is basically what it looks like. You discretize the planet, you discretize the sphere horizontally, and then inside each of these grid cells, you have a vertical discretization as well. The depth of the atmosphere is only around 10, 20 kilometers. The whole Earth is 40,000 kilometers, so the depth is very small. But many things are happening at very high resolution. So normally a grid cell today is on the order of 100 kilometers or so for a climate model. For weather models, you can bring it down. But for a climate model, it's around 100 kilometers. You have some extreme models which are called global cloud resolving models where they try to bring it down to 1 kilometer. They're very, very expensive, so you can't run them for very long times. But there are many processes which are going on at even smaller scales. So we call them sub-grid scales. They're below the scale of the grid of the model. Most importantly are clouds. You can see clouds outside. You know that they happen at very, very fine scales. So all these processes are put into a column of the model. The columns can all talk to each other. They can transport heat, moisture, CO2, whatever it is. If there's a flow of wind or the flow of ocean currents, they can transport these things. So with the increase in computing technology, we have tried to make these models more and more sophisticated, which means that you add more and more processes in this box, and you also try to increase the resolution. But we've been able to increase the resolution a fair amount, but not as much as you might imagine, because you know that computing technology has, in terms of the number of transistors and all that has gone up by 10 or so orders of magnitude. The resolution has gone up by 1 order of magnitude. The resolution of a Manabe model is around 500 kilometers. Today, it's around 50 or 25 kilometers. So why is this thing so hard? So if you look at the cloud field, this is what it looks like, seen from space. So you have many, many different kinds of clouds. You have these big mesoscale, tens or hundreds of kilometers size, and then you have these very small clouds. So if you look at one single grid box, it might contain all these kinds of clouds. So parameterizing convection has made some progress over the last 50 years from the Manabe model, which is 75 to today, but not as much as you might imagine. So basically, one of the thing is called the quasi-equilibrium hypothesis, that the clouds, as I said, are trying to use convection to move heat upwards and stabilize the atmosphere, whereas radiation is trying to destabilize it. And these two processes come into quasi-equilibrium. And you can say there's a population of clouds of different sizes, and you can work out what a distribution of clouds will do. And you can come up with a way to parameterize this. Parameterize this means you reduce this population of clouds to an equation which has only a few variables and a few parameters. And you can put that into a GCM. So that's how parameterization works. So this is happening inside a column. So the question why people say GCMs are obsolete is that this idea of doing these clouds inside a column, we have been trying it for 50 years, and the progress has been there, but it has been very small. And there are some problems which we have never solved. There are some, as I say in the last, there are some systematic biases. Many people tried different theories of clouds and put them in the model, but all of them seem to have certain problems. What is the reason? One thing I already told you, the cloud fields are very complex. You have stratus clouds, cumulus clouds, you have different types of clouds, so you might have them all in the same area. So they will also interact with each other. They get highly organized sometimes. That means that your grid box is around 100 kilometers, let's say, but you can have mesoscale systems which are bigger than that. That means that what is happening in your column depends on what is happening in your neighboring columns. So if you treat each column as independent, you will not get the right result. So you have to figure out how to do non-local physics, as you call it. So the physics of one column depends on what's happening in the neighboring column. There's many things that happen at very, very small scales. For example, you will have a cloud which is where the air is condensed, and it is because there is a convergence from below, it's going up. Outside it is air which is below the saturation, and those two are going to mix. And that mixing is happening by turbulent processes which are happening at fine scales. When the air descends, when it rains, you get a descending plume which is called a downdraft, and it will spread out. It's called a cold pool. So you get an air of cold air that lands on the ground and it spreads out. And at the front of the cold pool, where it is pushing the air, you can create convergence. So these things are happening at very fine scale of a few meters or tens of meters. And you're not modeling them because you're actually running on a model that's around 100 kilometers. Oops. Then there is microphysics, which is how actually does condensation take place. The water vapor has to reach saturation. Then you must have a nucleus, which is an aerosol, a very small particle, a micron-sized particle, and the water will condense on it and form a water droplet. And then water droplets will collide and form bigger drops, and then eventually, if they become big enough, they will fall, and that's called a hydrometeor or a rainfall. So all these things are happening at very small scales. We are just trying to parameterize all of them. So what happens is that schemes, you start with a very simple theory, like that Arakawa-Schubert theory I showed you. Once you start taking into account all these factors, the models tend to become very complex. And in the end, what people have actually become very frustrated and said, maybe clouds are not parameterizable at all. And maybe we should give it up. And all you should do is to increase the resolution until you resolve everything, so you cannot, you don't have to actually make any parameterization at all. You don't need a theory. You just do it simply by resolving the model. So people do this by running these models. So this is actually just to show that this has been done for a long time. This is from a paper that was written in the late 70s or early 80s. So you can see that this cloud field does not look unrealistic. It looks not very far from the satellite picture I showed you. But the problem is you're doing it now, the model resolution is around 1 kilometer. And so you cannot run it on any computer. You cannot run such a big model anymore. So this is run on a small domain. So this is just to understand how the cloud field behaves. So these are called CRMs, or cloud resolving models. And if you go to the boundary layer, where you have even smaller clouds, so the boundary layer depth of the atmosphere is around a couple of 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers. And so you have clouds which are actually very small. And you can have different things happen. You can have clouds like this, which are cumulus clouds, which are just single puffy little clouds. Sometimes the entire area can be saturated and you'll get a stratus cloud, which occupies the whole area. And the transition between these two things is very important for the climate problem, because a stratus cloud is white, it's big, and it reflects a lot of sunlight. Cumulus clouds are very small, they don't reflect as much. And the amount of heat you reflect actually will cool the planet as well. So the temperature depends very much on how this cloud field behaves. So these are called LES models, or large eddy simulation models. They're running at very small scale, usually around 1 meter or 10 meters in scale. Again, you can only run a small area. You cannot run such a model over the whole globe. It is computationally too expensive. So what can you do? So now these new techniques are starting to come in, such as machine learning and so forth. So the first thing people did was maybe take the GCM, which has a box of 100 kilometers. Inside each GCM, you put in a CRM in a two-dimensional cloud model. And this is called a superparameterization. Instead of trying to write down equations, you're actually trying to put a model inside each column. So because of computational cost, again, only 2D models have been used. So, and it also assumes that what is happening at the convective scale is very different from what is happening at the large scale. So it's assuming what is called a scale separation. So there's one set of dynamics happening at large scale and one set of dynamics happening at small scale, and you're trying to combine the two. The advantage of CRMs is that they are independent models, so they can kind of retain, they can understand what is happening in neighboring columns and so forth. So they've had some success. And what is more interesting for the machine learning problem is that you can also, if you can understand what is happening in the CRM, if you can have a lot of training data, you can use machine learning methods to emulate that using a neural network. And I'll talk about this later. In reality, though, there is no separation of large and small scales. It's not as easy as that. Everything is actually more complicated. So this is data from the old aircraft observations of kinetic energy in the atmosphere. So that's the energy on a log scale on the y-axis. And wavelength is the spatial scale of that on the x-axis. If you go to very large scales, all those thousands of kilometers, the slope of this curve is around k to the minus 3. So I don't know, so the people who have studied turbulence know that the minus 3 slope is associated with 2D turbulence, and turbulence that's happening in 2 dimensions. And then once you get to below 1,000 to 100 kilometers and so, the slope changes and it becomes a minus 5/3 slope. That is typically associated with 3-dimensional turbulence, when you have turbulence both in the horizontal and the vertical. And this minus 5/3 slope continues all the way down to 100 meters or even 10 meters. So there is no real scale separation. So what you're doing when you run a model at 100 kilometers, which is here, is that you just decided to truncate this turbulent cascade, as it's called, at whatever resolution you can afford based on the computer you have access to. And then you try to come up with a theory for what is happening, all the scales you cannot resolve. So based on ideas of what is called backscatter and so forth. So there is no real scale separation. So when you're doing something like superparameterization, you're applying superparameterization, scale separation where it doesn't exist. When you go to the ocean, this problem becomes even more difficult. Because the ocean, in the atmosphere, you can assume there is a surface which has some mountains and then it has a depth of around 10 or so kilometers. Here the depth varies greatly. It varies from 0, which is like when you're near the coast, to around 6 kilometers, 7 kilometers at the deepest part of the ocean. And if you look at the similar to this turbulence, there is a number called the baroclinic deformation radius, which is the size of the flow which is associated with turbulence in the ocean. And you compare that to the resolution. If you want to resolve this turbulent flow, that means in your delta axis, your resolution of your model, you need at least 2 grid points to show that there is an up and down. That number is around 1 degree, which is around 100 kilometers in some areas of the ocean. So you can resolve it with a model that's around 100 kilometer grid size. But for other areas of the ocean, you are getting down to 1/50th of a degree, which is around 2 kilometers in size. So it's very hard to resolve everything that is going on in the ocean on the turbulence scale as well. So this idea that was proposed that, okay, we cannot parameterize this problem, so we will just increase the resolution until everything is resolved, is not going to work either in the atmosphere of the ocean because there are limits on computing, which is what I'll get to next. So this is just showing what flow in the ocean looks like. So you can see that there are these eddies that are happening. These jets are actually happening at scales of 1 kilometer or so. The whole Atlantic basin, which is shown here, is around thousands of kilometers in size. So there's a big range in scales you have to deal with here. So people have tried saying that we can run these global cloud resolving models. And this picture is from one of these projects. There are many different people who have tried to run these models. One of these, actually, I don't know which one, is a picture from a satellite. And if you just look at it, you say, okay, I can't tell which one is a satellite picture. It means the global cloud resolving models are actually doing something which looks like a real cloud field. The only problem is, again, they're so expensive, you can only run them for around 10 or 20 days. Whereas I told you for the climate problem, you need to run the problem for hundreds of years. We'll get to that next as well. And so for running the climate problem, if you look at the resolution of the model, Moore's law, which says that computing power doubles every 18 months because transistors are getting miniaturized, says that every 18 months you should double. So you should be on the blue curve if you're following the line of computing technology. If you look at real models, you've seen that they've started to level off around 2010 or so, and I'll explain why in a minute. The other thing that I want to mention is that if you're doing climate science, and we'll get to this in a minute to the later part of the talk, what people want to understand about the climate. You want to understand, for example, that yes, it is warming, and we know that CO2 is one of the causes of warming. We know that methane is one of the causes of warming. So there are multiple causes of warming. You want to see which one is the real cause. So the real world only gives you observations of what is happening in the real world. In a model, what you can do is I can turn off everything excepting CO2. Then I can isolate what is only the effect of CO2. So these things are called counterfactual runs. There are runs which do not have any observations to work on them. So you can only do them in a model. So this graph from a paper called in 2009 shows that there are 3 kinds of uncertainty in the model. One is chaotic uncertainty. The model is a chaotic system, which means that if you change the initial conditions slightly, you'll get a different answer. So you have to sample that uncertainty. You have to change the initial conditions a few times and sample it. Over time, so this is how much time you're running the model. So it's 100 years here. So as you go in time, this uncertainty dies out. There's a second uncertainty, which is called the scenario uncertainty, which is we don't know what the future trajectory of CO2 will be. It depends on policies of nations and so forth. So we're treating what humans are doing as being outside the system. So that's big uncertainty that's coming from the scenarios, dependent on policies and human actions. And the third thing is this thing that is called structural uncertainty. We don't understand the physics fully. And if you look at the problem around 2 decades or 3 decades, that's where this uncertainty, where the fact that we don't understand the physics is contributing the most to the uncertainty of the problem. And this is where we have to try out these different experiments, as I said. Do you want to know whether the warming is coming from CO2 or methane? We need to do runs with only CO2 forcing, only methane forcing. So these are what I'm calling counterfactual runs. We need hundreds of runs of these kind because there are many, many factors in the climate, which is why I'm interested in everything, as I said, because everything plays a role in this. And so you must be able to run, this is why I'm saying, if you want a climate model, you must be able to run hundreds of simulations, each of which is 100 years in length, and you want to solve it in a reasonable amount of time. You know, you're a PhD student, you need to complete your PhD. So you cannot be waiting 10 years for your runs to complete, right? So you need to complete this in a reasonable amount of time. So this is the requirement for a climate model to work. I am going to skip a few of the details in order to get to the meat of this talk, which is to talk about computing technology. So this is the key result, again, that must be kept in mind. One of the reasons why the model resolution started to plateau around 2010 or so, if you look at this graph, you may understand one reason why this might be the case. So Moore's law says you keep miniaturizing your transistors, and each time you make it smaller, everything has to travel a smaller distance, so your computing gets faster. So that used to be true. Dennard wrote a paper, this is called Dennard scaling. Dennard wrote a paper in 1974. He showed that as you keep increasing the resolution, if you reduce the resolution by a factor of 2, your computation will become a factor of 2 faster. But he also showed that what's called the power density, then you're putting more transistors into the same area on a chip. He showed that the energy requirements do not change because the transistors are getting smaller for the same amount of energy now. If you double the size, you can do 4 times the number of computations, twice as fast, but in the same area. What happened was that as the transistors got to a certain size, there's a physical limit on this. Once you get below a certain size, they're so small that miniaturizing them further puts 2 transistors so close together, they start like talking to, they start interacting with each other. The heat dissipation from currents flowing through one transistor affects the other one and so forth. So because of that, around 2008, 2010, this green figure is the one you pay attention to. It's called the frequency. So if you saw the frequency is what if you buy a phone or a laptop, you'll see reported that you have a processor that's 1 gigahertz or 2 gigahertz or whatever it is. That number has not changed. It has stayed on the order of gigahertz. So 10 to the 3 megahertz is around 1 gigahertz. It's stayed on the order of a few gigahertz. And if you look back at phone technologies or laptop technology going back a few decades, you'll see that that particular number has never changed. It used to change. If you're buying laptops in the early 2000s or in the 1990s, you'll see that each new generation will give you a bigger number for this. So in that era, which is when I started doing some of my research work, if you were running a problem and it was not running fast enough, you just wait. A couple of years later, you buy a bigger computer and you can do the problem because your computer would be faster. That stopped happening around 10 years ago. And that's because of this thing that I'm calling the end of Dennard scaling. So what that means is that you can look at 2 kinds of problems for the people who are interested in the computational aspect of this. One is called weak scaling. That means you can solve a bigger problem in the same amount of time because you can have more things happening in parallel. You cannot actually make the computation go faster. So you cannot make what is called strong scaling. So the same problem at the same size will not get faster on your next computer. All you can do is to do bigger problems at the same time. So the climate problem, which requires you to do 100-year simulations in a reasonable amount of time, it stopped getting faster. So the rate kind of stopped. So the change of resolution also kind of stopped for these models. So again, I'll skip some of the details of this. So what should we do instead? What new computers are very good at is this problem, which is called the deep learning or the construction of neural networks. Computers are very good at this because it depends on a lot of parallel arithmetic. So why is this? So let's take a problem where you have 5 inputs and 4 outputs, and you're trying to find the relationship between these based on some data. So with 5 inputs and 4 outputs, you do the math in your head. That's around 20 operations to figure out, there are 20 ways you can combine these things. So what I can do instead, I can put in a hidden layer in the middle called a layer of neurons, and I put in 7 here. Now the number of operations you have to do to work out this relationship, you can see it, you can measure it by the number of black lines. So it's 5 times 7 times, so that's 5 times 35, and then here there's 28 on this side. So you see that I've vastly increased the number of operations to do the same calculation. So this is a classic weak scaling problem. Deep learning means I put multiple layers of neurons. Now you can just see visually how many operations I'm doing to do the same calculation to go from 5 inputs to 4 outputs. So we can dramatically, if you do this problem which we call dense linear algebra, you can do dramatically more operations, so you can build very complicated, beautiful relationships between your input and outputs, nonlinear ones. And you can do that using these neural networks. So they've been very successful at working out, if you have amount of data that says, given these inputs, I expect these outputs, and you have a lot of data, deep learning has been super successful at working out these relationships. That's why you're seeing all these applications, ChatGPT and all these that you're seeing. All that is based on this idea. So this is working very well on modern computers. So how do we apply them to climate science? So one thing you can do is that you take a time series from a model. So this is a model running a very classical, it's not a GCM or anything just yet. It's a very simple form of a chaotic time series, which is called the Kuramoto-Sivashinsky equation. So you give it a time series, that is your training data, and the neural network learns to emulate it, and then now you're taking the difference between these two, and you see that even though it's chaotic means that after a certain time, a chaotic system, even if you know the initial conditions very well, will start to diverge because you don't know them with infinite precision. You're seeing that for a fair amount of time, you're getting a good result. So you're able to, you do not have any theory. This is just saying it looked at the data, it does not have any, does not know what the equation is, but it worked out what is the relationship between the inputs and outputs and is able to emulate it directly. This is called emulation. You're taking a time series of data and you're trying to create a neural net that will exactly give you that time series again. So that's called an emulation. What it cannot do is to extrapolate to a new situation, which is a new set of data, because it has not actually worked out what the equation is. So in this equation, there is one free parameter. If I change that parameter and present it to the same neural net, it will not be able to predict it because it has not seen that data before. Climate is a classic problem of non-stationarity. That means, what that means is that if we have access to, let's say, the data from the 20th century or up to 2020, and we're trying to predict what will happen in 2060, let's say. If you just use data from the historical period, there is no reason to believe that whatever relationships you learn in the data is going to apply in the future. And there are a couple of papers I've referenced here which actually show this. What we can do, however, is that you can use models that have been run into the future and use that for training. That works. So this is how they showed it. They ran a model out to 2100. If you show the neural network the data out to 2100, it does a perfect job of reproducing it. If I only showed the data until the year 2000 and ask it to predict 2000 to 2100, it does not do a great job because the climate has changed and the neural network has not seen any data from the changed climate. So these are papers. By the way, these slides I will distribute to you, and all the blue things are links. If you're interested in following any of this literature, all the links are available here. Again, some details which may be a little too technical, I'm going to skip. So what we have shown is that in this paper is that the people who claim that by resolving it I will reduce the uncertainty because I no longer have these uncertain parameters. What it is showing is that the models that have resolved the uncertainty, which are shown in red, in the models which are traditional GCMs, they have about the same spread. In some cases, they have the CRMs, the cloud resolving models, have a smaller amount of uncertainty, but for other variables, they have about exactly the same spread. So we are showing that resolution alone is not going to solve the problem. There's a certain amount of inherent uncertainty in the problem, and we have to deal with it. Yeah, please, Raghu.
Yeah, so we talked about the future uncertainties being dominated by scenarios at some point. So when we look for this 20th century to 21st century skill, it's a bit, it's hard. We shouldn't expect that, right? Because we have gone from first principles to adding this junk scenarios, which obviously the model, the neural net cannot predict. But if you give it to 1900 to 1950, then we can see whether it will do 1950 to 2000. Isn't that a more fair assessment of skill?
Yeah, we can do that, but even on a 50-year time scale, there is a warming signal. Even that it will not do correctly. So mostly these models have been have done using 1850 to 2100, and you keep changing the amount of training data you expose to the neural net. And typically, the later you get, and then in terms of the scenarios, there are multiple scenarios. Some of them are showing modest amounts of CO2 increase, like RCP 2.6, and then there's RCP 8.5, which is showing, basically lot of increase in CO2. So usually they do this testing with the extreme end of this.
Okay.
So basically, what happens is that and I think that will be true even if you compare the first half of the 20th century with the second half. You will still see.
If you just restrict yourself to the part where the model uncertainties dominate, then you can only expect the extrapolation to work that much, right?
I see the point you make. So in the Hawkins and Sutton diagram, you're saying it's only good for 20, 40 years, so you should not go beyond that. Yeah. But the fact is, the satellite era is 60 years old. So extent of our good data is about 60 years. So you should at least be able to predict out to 2060, 2080. We would like to, under various scenarios. And yeah. Now let's return to the LES model. The LES model I showed you earlier, it's modeling boundary layer clouds. And I told you that the boundary layer clouds can be either cumulus, which means they're very small. There are very small white dots on a black, but the ocean looks black from space. So if you have cumulus over the ocean, it looks like small white dots on a black surface. That means most of the incoming heat is being absorbed. If you get stratus, the entire area becomes white and most of the heat becomes reflected, which is cooling. And there is a transition from one to the other. So this is the one key thing we want to model, because if under warming, you go from a stratus regime to a cumulus regime, then that's going to be quite disastrous, because there's going to be an amplification of the warming, because more heat is going to reach the ocean surface. So what people do in this experiment is they are looking at various sites. There are about 23 sites which are used to study this problem in models. And if you look at this, this is using two models, and this is a measure of how whether the models agree or disagree. And they disagree quite a lot. So two different models are giving very, very different results at these various sites. Now what you can do is that you can use LES to force, so the models themselves, the parameterization is wrong, let's agree. So using LES forced at these, run with the forcing from these models at these sites, and now the LES starts to blue means that they're more or less agreeing. So they're starting to agree more and more, not everywhere, but in most areas. At least compared to this, the uncertainty has been vastly reduced. So you can use this thing, the LES models, to reduce the uncertainty in the GCMs. So how do we use this coupled with machine learning is the next thing that I want to get to. So the fact that the high-resolution models do well, but we cannot run them very long, so how do we use them as training data for learning? So use it through this process called emulation. So you can use it basically so that you can say that your model has a certain number of parameters, and you try to learn the values of these parameters by running high-resolution models. So what this looks like is you write what's called the cost function. The cost function says that there are a certain number of parameters whose values are unknown, and there are a certain number of observations I have. And let's say I have n different types of observations, temperature, precipitation, and so forth. I will create a cost function which is a weighted average of all these normalize and weight all these different observations, these n different types of observations. And I vary the parameters until I minimize the cost function. So that means then I've fitted the parameters to the data that I have. So the 2 or 3 things you might think about already. Well, how are you assigning the weights? How do you decide what's important, what's not important? That often comes down to the history of the lab that you work in. So one classic example that I can show you, I don't have that slide here, is that if you look at the model that's built at the Institute of Tropical Meteorology in Pune, they will give a lot of weight to the Indian monsoon as a way of judging whether their model is of good quality or not. If you look at a model taken from the US, they will give much less weight to it. So this omega, which is the weight you give to a particular metric, is actually different from model to model. 2 other things for people who are familiar with the machine learning area will know about this. You cannot allow data leakage. That is, you cannot tune to one thing and then claim that I succeeded because I got that right, because you used it for tuning. So it's called data leakage. So the training data and the validation data must be kept separate. The second thing is you must avoid overfitting because you have a noisy time series. So you don't want to try to fit every little thing because some of it is just, it's a chaotic time series. So the details actually, some of it is just noise. So you have to be sure that you're not just fitting to noise. So this is called the tuning problem. So there are a couple of labs which are trying to, you can also decide in the tuning I mentioned these stratus clouds. So there are areas here, for example, off the coast of South America and off the coast of California, which have these large stratus decks. These clouds that reflect a lot of light. And most models have a bias in this. They don't predict the stratus clouds enough. So they have a bias in this. They under-predict these things. So you can do two things, right? I can tune some parameters only to reduce this bias or the overall bias. So in this study, they tried to compare these two. So if I try to tune to remove this error, because I think it's the biggest error in my model, I find that the overall error varies. So when you're choosing to minimize some error, which is what is called the cost function, it really matters what you choose. And it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. So you have a lot of choices in how you do this. So this is where, in this paper that I referred to, it is called the art and science of model tuning, because there is a little bit of art also. You make some choices based on what you want to achieve. So this is a set of papers on how this tuning was achieved. And they talk about the difficulties of doing this. Is very nicely, the tuning process is very nicely described in this set of papers for anybody who's interested. And then there are questions such as this. Should I tune to get the 20th century right? So the 20th century, the black line shows that this is somewhat related to Raghu's question. So the black line shows what the 20th century temperature evolution, the global mean surface temperature evolution actually looks like. And the model that was produced by GFTL in CMIP5, which is around 10 years ago, was the green one. It had what's called a cold bias. Even though the early part of the 20th century looked correct, the later part, it had a distinct cold bias. It was much colder. So in this study, Golas found that he can tune the model to get the 20th century, that's the red one. He can make it warmer. But if he does that, then he loses skill in some other areas. So this becomes a choice of, if I can tune for this, then I will lose that. So this is where this weighting and how you weight different things in the cost function comes in. That's where the art comes in. You have to make choices. So what we can do is using the same kind of approach of writing down a function which is in this set of papers, it's called the implausibility function. So you can do the opposite process. You can kind of say, are there areas of parameters, instead of saying which is the best fit to the data, ask which areas are completely inconsistent with the data. And you want to eliminate all of those. So the new approaches are trying to use machine learning to, you cannot run the forward model, the GCM, many times. You can only run it a few times. So given that constraint, how do you do this problem of elimination? The way you do it is by using what are called emulators. So you have an LES model which is used as the reference. So you're considering this the truth. And you have what's called a single column model, a model of one column. And you've written down the equations for clouds inside this column. And you try to fit the parameters of this to that reference value. And the way you do that is by building what is called a Gaussian process emulator, which is trying to emulate these and trying to find the values of these parameters for many runs of this LES. So they're called Gaussian processes. Once you do the fitting, you'll get some set of values. So the way this works is that because you're only judging implausibility with these emulators, you see which values of parameters are ruled out. And then you're left with a smaller space, which is called the NROI space, the not ruled out yet space. And you can do that for many metrics one after another. So you can successively keep reducing the NROI space until you get to a few values of parameters, which you must check with a GCM. But now, instead of exploring the whole space with a GCM, you're only exploring a few values. This is where machine learning is actually transforming the way we do this work. Yeah, I think you should use a mic. The question, no, I'll repeat the question, don't worry, sir. The question was, is there an assumption that the LES gets the statistics right? Yes, there is very much an assumption. So you're assuming that the LES is truth. Yeah, eventually it's validated. So if the LES has been sampled, so what eventually ends up happening, I think I'll refer to it on a later slide, is that if the LES has samples wide enough variety of cloud regimes, then you can trust it.
I have a generic request that philosophical questions, please save it for the end. If there is something not clear, maybe stop and ask.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So
longer
I will defer philosophical questions to the end. Okay, fair enough. So this is showing that you can, so these are taking 3 different parameters of the model and is varying them and trying to find a fit. So the black dot is the truth. The black dot is the value you get from the LES. And you can see that this method is actually zooming in on this value pretty well. It's actually doing a pretty good job of finding the correct value. One other thing it does is that sometimes for certain configurations of the model, the NROI space becomes 0. So that means this is the size of the NROI space. You can see that some of these runs have gone down to 0. What is that telling you? It is telling you that no values of parameters in your equations can possibly fit the data. What does that mean? It means that your equations are wrong. That means your theory of the clouds is wrong because no values of the parameters are fitting. So that's what we call structural error. So it's not an error in the value of parameter in your equations. The equation itself is incorrect. That means you have to go back and find a new set of equations. So this method is able to narrow down the number of, again, set of papers to read, narrow down all the values of the parameters that you might possibly want to, you cannot explore the whole parameter space using GCMs. So you narrow it down using emulators, which are very fast. So you can run 10,000, 100,000 of these in a day. And then you narrow it down to a few sets of parameter values, which you have to test with a real GCM. And sometimes that set becomes a null set. There are no values of parameters which are fitting it. That means that your equations are wrong. You have to reformulate your model. So both these things you can do. There's a similar approach from a group called CLIMA. I want to save some time for questions, so I'm going to say this is called the calibrate, emulate, sample method. It's also, again, mostly I wanted to give all these papers for people who are interested. So you can also look at these. And then let's get to one last problem that I want to highlight as well. So this cannot be, we could not do this using a real model, but we want to get to a real model. So let's call we're trying to build a very simple model that behaves something like an AOGCM. AOGCM means atmosphere, ocean, general circulation model. So if you remember, I mentioned that the atmosphere has very fast timescales. Its decorrelation timescale is measured in the order of a week or 2. So that you can think of it as a fast part of the climate system. The ocean is very slow. It has a lot of memory. Some changes to the ocean, if you warm the ocean, it will take many years for it to give the heat back. So it has very slow timescales. So Lorenz wrote a model called the Lorenz 96 model, it's called, where you have one set of variables, x. Again, it's a nonlinear equation. And you have one set of variables called y. So you can, schematically, the x's are represented on the inner ring and the y's are represented on the outer ring. So you can see that this x is kind of linked to all those y's. So you can think of it as x can be an ocean model. So it's varying slowly. The x's are slowly varying. The y's are higher resolution and they're varying. They have fluctuations on smaller time and space scales. And they're coupled. So you see that the y appears in the x equation and the x appears in the y equation. So they're coupled to each other. So now you have a system with 2 time scales, one fast, one slow. And you have 4 parameters, f, h, c, b. So you run the model again. You use one run of the model as the truth, where you've chosen certain values of these 4 parameters, f, h, c, b. So that's called the truth run. And then you want to discover these. Now, so this is the calibration process. So you now have written down the equations and you're trying to find, based on comparing to your truth, what are the values of these parameters. So if you want to just do it for the atmosphere, you apply only the y constraints and you run only the A part, the atmospheric part of the model. And if you want to do the ocean part, you apply only the x constraints. And you investigate how much you need to run. So this is a paper we have written, which is currently in review. And what we find is that it does a pretty good job of reducing the NROI space so that you can do this pretty efficiently. But there's some interesting things I want to point out. So for example, let's take like this one, for example. The true value is here, that's the black dot. But you can see that it could have been either about, maybe you can see it here also. So for these 2 parameters, f and c, there's 2 sets of values that could possibly fit the data. So this is what happens sometimes in the real world when you're trying to tune a climate model. you're trying to, you built a couple model, you're trying to fit it to the data, and you're varying parameters in two different components, let's say atmosphere and ocean. You can do what is called a system where you end up with compensating errors. You make you make an error in the atmosphere model and you make an error in the ocean model, but the two of them sum up to cancel each other. So that's called compensating errors. That often happens in modeling, unfortunately, and we do not have a way of exploring the parameter space sufficiently because the model is so expensive. But in these sorts of methods, you can at least detect when this is happening, because if you see two sets of places where the solution seems to have the same amount of error, that means one of them is the right and one of them is a compensating error case. We have to find out how it is. So these are two approaches that are being used for machine learning to solve the problem. So when you have structural error, you have to find a new set of equations. How do you do it? So this is a third application of machine learning, which is being quite successful. So what they do here, it's a combination of what's called regression methods and symbolic methods. So you say that, okay, I have an equation which is dependent on a certain number of variables. I don't know what the equation is. So you randomly try various equation combinations until you find something that fits using a technique that's called the relevance vector machine. So it will tell you which variables are relevant to your problem and in what combination. So based on this study, what they showed was that, okay, so what's happening here is that you run a certain simulation at very high resolution, 7.5 kilometers. That's the top curve there. If you run the same equation, but you run it at 30 kilometers, you do not get the same amount of energy as you're supposed to get. So you get much less amount of energy. What they did was they tried to find, one is that you just simply put a neural net and fit the high resolution data and you try to apply it to low resolution. You do a pretty good job. That's the purple curve. Here they did something better. They actually found an equation that appears to fit the data. So it is called equation discovery using machine learning. So this method has also been quite successful. Not quite as successful as a pure neural net, but the difference is that here this is interpretable because you have an equation. You actually can see physically what does it mean. Whereas here all you can say that it's a good statistical fit. So this is the third approach using machine learning that is changing the way we are doing these models. And then finally, I want to get to the problem of non-locality. So we have originally organized the problem in the form of a column, and we're trying to understand what is happening inside the column based on only column variables. So in the neural net, what that means is the input vector of predictors are column variables, and your output vector is also column variables. But neural nets don't care. For them, it's just a bunch of numbers. So you can make a larger input vector, and you can give it also values from neighboring columns, and it will learn from that also, because it's just doing a fitting to that. So when they do this, what they're calling the 3D neural net, which is a non-local problem, they're finding a much better fit. So, and this is physically, we know that I gave you the reasons why we think for clouds, this is a good thing, because clouds, you cannot break them up into columns. There's a lot of organization which is happening on large scale, so neighboring columns affect each other pretty closely. So, and we can also do this thing in time as well. So you can also include, supposing it depends on the history of what has been happening. The memory in the system can also be brought in by keeping values from the previous time step also in your input vector. So these are all powerful methods that are coming in. It is allowing you to retain the structure of the GCM, but also allow you to go to address some of the weaknesses of these models. So again, a set of papers. And then finally, I want to get to two sets of things about the counterfactuals. The GCMs are too expensive to do this kind of study that I'm showing here. So when in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they want to say which particular forcing is contributing most to present-day warming. So you have CO2, of course, but you also have methane, you have N2O, you have a whole bunch of other things which are all contributing. How do you do this in a model? You would vary CO2 but keep everything else fixed. That will give you the contribution from CO2 alone. And then you do the same. You keep vary only methane and keep everything else fixed. Now look at the number of forcings they want to explore. They're around 15. So that means 15 different runs of the GCM, and each one has to be about 100 years in length for 4 or 5 different scenarios. It is essentially too expensive. Nobody can do this. So how this study has been done is by using what they call emulators as well. And the way the emulators work is this. They take the existing GCMs, and they have a huge spread by the end of the 21st century. There is a recognized in AR6, in the current thing in CMIP6, there is what's called the hot model problem. Many models are predicting a lot of warming by the end of the 21st century. If you look at what they did in the latter part of the historical period, in the last 40 years, these warm models have a bias also. They start very cool and they suddenly shoot up towards warm. So we know that they have some problem in the last part of the 20th century. So what IPCC did was to use emulators to constrain and throw out all the models that have this kind of peculiar behavior. And then they came up with a much reduced range of uncertainty of this. But the thing is, this is done purely statistically at this point. There is no basis, there is no theoretical basis for doing this. They just said that these models are not fitting the last 40 years, so we're going to discard them. And these models also, the models that are used for doing these kinds of studies are also vary amongst themselves. Two different of these, what are called reduced complexity models, will give different results. The advantage to them is that they're millions of times faster than a climate model. So you can run them many, many times to explore a lot of this uncertainty. So just as I said, LES and CRM and all, you can run them for a short period of time, you can learn the physics and you try to emulate it for building a GCM. The same claim is being made. The role of the ESM is becoming a target for emulation. So the GCM is not being used directly for getting the result, but it's the place where it is physically consistent with itself because it's based on physics. So we understand that physically it makes sense, and then you can try to emulate that. So that's the claim that was made here. The role of the ESM is as a target for emulation. So I'm going to skip, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip the paleoclimate part and I'll just get to the end. But if anybody's interested in talking about the past warm climates and so forth, we can talk about this. So climate and weather are two different things. That's the first remark I want to make. People often forget that. Whether you're just trying to plot the trajectory of the Earth system for a short amount of time.
Meantime, since I stopped that discussion, I'll maybe Raghu has on what you're discussing.
No, you didn't stop it, but I think it's a very technical assumption, not philosophical. I'm not sure why Vishal thought it was philosophical. Because when you use CRMs and LESs to go after GCMs, there is a very not so subtle assumption that they're giving you the right statistics, which is because we don't have enough data. So where do you think in the future data can be made more dense to reach some of the points, or at least verify because clouds are still a huge problem, right? So do you think there are any satellite technologies that will give enough data to get the statistics verified of the CRMs and LESs? That's a very technical issue, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good point. So we are using, for a lot of these things, we are using models as a proxy for observations. So, and we are assuming that the models as a proxy for observations are being successful.
Famous line, George Philander, who you know well, used in the 1980s, saying, now the models are so good, we don't need observations anymore.
Yeah. Manabe had a similar comment, by the way. It's not quite the same thing. But Manabe said that I can't believe your observations until I see it in my model. So, yeah. Because observations can be due to various factors, whereas models guarantee that there's physical consistency. So the issue of physical consistency, I think, is an important one. So I think I highlight that on one of my... So these reduced complexity models that are used for emulation, I don't think they should become completely decoupled from physical models. If you do purely statistical models, the issue is the one that can you believe that the statistical fit that you learned from the last 6 years, again, is the problem of stationarity. The climate is not stationary. So is the statistical fit you learned from the historical period, is it good for the future? So that's a question you cannot answer from a purely statistical model. Unless there is a physical basis, you cannot really answer this question. But the fact that there is you're always going to be calibrated, any model is going to be calibrated using data, so you're going to be doing these things. But I want to get back to Raghu's point. So are we sure that the statistics from these models are right? No, we are not sure. It's an assumption we are making. We make this assumption at lower resolution as well. So for example, in the climate problem, there are many fluctuations in temperature and all that. Some of it is natural. So it's a chaotic system. So what we do is we run a model called a pre-industrial control model, where every forcing from outside is kept fixed. And then you keep running the model for 100 years, 1,000 years, and it will fluctuate. So sometimes you will get, for a few years you will get a departure, it will become warm. For a few years it will get cold. All these things will happen. So we call that the internal variability of the model. And we are assuming without sufficient data that the internal variability of the model is same with the natural variability of the real atmosphere, the real climate system. There's no real basis for making that assumption, it's just an assumption. But a lot of studies that are saying, which are trying to distinguish forced variability from natural variability, are making that assumption.
Who would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. In the meantime, I'll pass it on.
The technical question is, in all the tuning that you showed, where is the uncertainty in observation? And this goes back to Manab's comment. Where is the uncertainty in observations coming into play? And also, you talked about using reanalysis for tuning, but reanalysis also uses data assimilation. So are you not counting for the same data twice?
Yeah.
That's one. And the second question is, like I said, it's philosophical. Is there really anything called aleatory uncertainty? Is it not because of the lack of knowledge?
Yeah, so let's, I'll get to both of them. So one way since you mentioned reanalysis, so we often use two reanalysis, the NSEP-NCAR reanalysis and the ECERA, the ECMWF reanalysis. And the difference between these two as the bounds of observational uncertainty. So they're both ingesting.
Observations will also have, like retrieval algorithms will have uncertainty.
Yeah, they will have also. But this is the best we can do. There's two different centers which have taken the same satellite observations, and they've done reanalysis from using those. And they're giving different results. Often the ERA and NSEP-NCAR don't agree. And you can, on the same kinds of scatter plots, I can also draw these 2 points, and that will give you the bounds of observational uncertainty. So that's one way of thinking about it. But yeah, the fact that you're using reanalysis, which is already model-driven, is a weakness. So it is counting twice. And I will use that as a cautionary note for the people who are looking at the papers that are coming out, which are saying that pure machine learning is doing the weather forecasting problem. Often those are trained on reanalysis, so they're actually model-based. And they cannot do better than the model because they're model-based. So that's a weakness that often they don't mention. They say that we have surpassed model, and they will of course run faster than the models, but they're based on models. Reanalysis are models and not observations. I think that's an important point. And then the philosophical point was, what is aleatory uncertainty? I think so. In the Hawkins-Sutton diagram, you can see it. You can see the difference between these two. The signatures are changed. The aleatory uncertainty dies out over time.
The question is, if we had all information possible, would you still have aleatory uncertainty? I mean, at the end of the day, is it not because of lack of knowledge?
No, I don't agree, because the Lawrence 63 paper shows that unless you have infinite, not only all the data, but also infinite precision, unless you have infinite precision, even the error in the last bit, I mean, the Lawrence 63 paper arose because he was transcribing some numbers and he made an error in the 4th decimal place. And that led to that error basically in the end gives you a totally different solution. So I think chaotic uncertainty, what I call chaotic uncertainty here, which you're calling aleatory uncertainty, is definitely real. I mean, I don't think you will ever have, you cannot have infinite precision definitely not on a digital computer. So you will definitely have something that is purely random, which is not based on lack of knowledge. Yeah.
Basically, you have, I wanted to ask you if neural network can be used to separate out the forced variability and the internal variability, which you have mentioned to Raghu while answering Raghu. And how it can be used. Can you give me, few?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have an immediate answer to that. The difficulty I see with that is whether we have sufficient observational data actually to constrain what is internal variability. Because we only have access to one planet Earth. It is subject to forcing, changing forcing. We do not really have access to an unforced plan.
You cannot train the neural network, right?
Yeah, so there is no training for the neural network to have to do the purely natural. So the only way we can do it is, as I said, using a model, a model that's a control run where the forcings are kept fixed. That's the only possible source of data for training. And since we don't know if that data, as I was saying to Raghu, since we don't know if that data itself is a true measure of natural variability, whether the internal variability of a model is a true measure of natural variability, I don't think the neural network can do better than that, I would say. Yeah. Karthik?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for an enlightening talk. I just have one big question, and I'll also give you the reasons. So I want to know what should be the realistic expectation of an emulator. I'm asking this question because first is, I think towards the end you have provided several case studies which are quite realistic in the sense we are always crippled by stationarity. Be it weeding out some of the unrealistic models. We are also relying on the historical data. So there is the issue of stationarity, and second is ability of these models to model the persistence in the sense how is the memory. So we have to keep adding more and more variables, which again increases the complexity of the model. So essentially we have to run the GCMs and also run the machine learning models.
Yeah.
And third is typically these machine learning models are do very well in simulating the means. But when it comes to the low frequency events, that's where they may crack. So if you are just looking at the correlations, they may do very well. But when we have to look at how well they are simulating these extremes, that's where there could be a problem. So I wanted to know what should be our realistic expectation of emulators.
So I think that's a great question. So this was actually my last slide. Actually, it appears there's one more slide. I don't know what it is, but this was supposed to be my last slide. Why do I insist that GCMs are not the end of the road, but they're the crossroads? I don't think the GCMs have reached the end of the road. What makes the GCM special in this whole, all this spectrum of models we're dealing with, including the emulators which are in the bottom right here, is that the variables are physically consistent with each other because they're physics-based. So if I look at pure data streams of temperature and humidity, there's no reason for them to have any consistency. They're measured by different sensors, measured by different satellites. There's no reason for them to have any consistency at all, which is why we do data assimilation, which is why we do reanalysis. We are trying to take the observations that we have, we're trying to enforce physical consistency on them, which is why when you go to the top things there, which are the CRM and the GCRM, they're useful as training, but they have to somehow come to this intermediate stage, which is the GCM. And then the GCM is which is not being done now. These emulators have become purely statistical. So I am fearing that IPCCs, I think they did it because they were under a lot of time constraints, but they're placing an excessive reliance on these emulators at this point. And they're not making a proper linkage between these two things. So for me, the thing is the phrase that I keep using: physical consistency. If you're using statistical models or emulators to predict two things, two physically different variables, how do I know what the problem you raised are correlations? How do I know that the correlations between them are being maintained correctly? Unless you actually enforce it. Unless you say that the covariances also are going to be part of my training.
Complexity of the...
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So if I have two variables, T and Q, let's say water vapor and temperature as a classic examples, and then I say that T prime, Q prime bar also has to be consistent with the data. Now I've taken two variables and gone to three variables. So as you say, we keep adding the complexity, and it will keep exploding, right? As you try to add more and more variables, it will keep exploding.
So I'm just asking, you are talk about uncertainty. So there is a three type of uncertainty you have says that. One is chaotic, scenario, and structural epistemic.
Epistemic, yeah.
Yeah. So, sir, I just want to ask, are we talking about GCMs, reducing complexity and everything? So which from your view is bigger uncertainties in this? Which you feel we should work it out on that, scenario, chaotic, or structural epistemic?
No, well, scenario is outside scope, right? Scenario we have no control over. We have no control over what policies will change and how they will change, so, you know, how governments will react and all, there's no way we can, I mean, at least I'm not in the business of trying to model that.
Okay.
So I think that is entirely out, as far as I'm concerned, that's out of scope. The aleatory uncertainty, the chaotic uncertainty, we have some handle on because we can study the internal variability of the model to show what are the limits of that. The part that we can control is the third part of that Hawkins uncertainty diagram, which is the structural epistemic uncertainty. So that's the one that we really must improve.
So,
Yeah.
so sir, if we talk about scenario uncertainty, as you were saying, we don't have any control. Like it is a government thing which is going on.
Yeah.
So at present, government is also very pushing towards policy making and different policy they are coming with that. So it is something which can affect GCMs also, like GCM scenario uncertainties or different scenarios.
No, yeah, of course it can. So I'll give you one example, which is from the CM5 time, I think. So around, so the people who are developing these scenarios, they started around 2014 or so, and they had predicted a certain trajectory for, not for the carbon, but for the aerosol forcing, which is actually a cooling agent, that's basically pollutants. And by the time the experiments were being run, which is around 2017, the measurements were showing that the data, the projections were actually wrong. Between the time the scenarios were written, it was shown to be wrong. In particular, China had reduced its aerosol production. Sulfates emissions from China had actually drastically reduced in that period of time between the publication of the emissions and the running of the simulations. So many things had to be rerun because they had to correct the data. So yes, the scenarios do evolve in response to what is happening in the real world. It's a scenario for 2040, we have no way of predicting it. Many countries have made net zero pledges and all that, but we know if you go to follow what's happening in the COP, people make pledges, but they don't do anything. So we can't rely on pledges. So that's where the verification comes in. So every COP we go and say, okay, you said this last time and you haven't done anything. So that is the part where I'm saying we have no control over that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
As a token of appreciation towards the excellent talk he gave today, let us request the convener of IDP Climate Studies, Professor Ghosh, to present a small token of appreciation to Professor Balaji and hold that while somebody clicks a photo. So I request maybe Repan to click a photo and yeah, thanks a lot. So let us give him a big round of applause for this talk. And with that, we will conclude.